Um, yeah, actually, so I wasn't here yesterday, but I followed the Twitter stream and I got the impression that actually the licensing framework and what we've done for metadata licensing has been discussed quite extensively. So I decided not to talk too much about that and keep it a little bit short. But real quick, this is, when it comes to metadata, the licensing framework, and it's really simple now. Your metadata goes to Europeana under the terms of the DEA. Europeana combines that metadata, and that powers the Europeana website, can be published as linked open data, published via the Europeana APIs. On all these channels, it's available to third-party users and end users under the CC0 public domain dedication, which means everybody can use it without any restrictions. We've developed a metadata usage guidelines, which will be displayed alongside the CC0 thing, which takes care about things like attribution, asking people to share back corrections, identify errors, treat the data with respect in general. But the framework is actually quite simple now, or when it will be implemented. There's not so much more to talk about, actually, and that's why I think the open data thing from the licensing perspective is something we have solved for Europeana, hopefully. What I want to talk today about is open content. I had a short discussion with Stefan yesterday over dinner, and he refers to that as open data as well. For him, as a computer scientist, like all the digital objects are data as well, and there's a certain logic to that. But traditionally, we have made, also when talking about the data provider agreement, this strict separation between data, which is the descriptive metadata, which is provided to Europeana, and content, which are the digital objects which Europeana links to. But in the end, Europeana is, of course, not about the descriptive information about this content. Europeana is about the content it makes available to its end users. And let's have a look at Europeana and how it treats rights in content. Part of what what's enshrined in the Europeana Data Exchange Agreement is that you, as a data provider, if there's any data providers here in the audience right now, otherwise the data providers have to identify through the use of the Europeana rights field what rights, access rights apply to the digital objects that are made available through Europeana. And actually that is implemented on the Europeana website. You can, if you have search results, in this case I've searched for Wien or Vienna, it shows you you can basically filter the search results according to the rights statements applied to that. There's in total 6 Creative Commons licenses. There's in total, I think, about 12 different rights statements, so we've simplified that a little bit. But the first thing you will note on top of there, not all objects show rights information. In fact, if you add the numbers up there, you get to about maybe 21,000 objects which carry rights information. If you look up there, does this thing have a... if you look up there, you see it's 61,000 objects which have been found, which says about 1/3 of the objects is actually labeled with rights information. That is something which is a mandatory field and which is the prerequisite for users to understand what they can do with the field. So that's the first challenge we're facing if we want to open up the content which is available through Europeana, simply identifying what rights apply to this content. This, of course, is because a lot of this content was added to Europeana before this Europeana rights field was actually mandatory, so we expect this problem to solve itself over time, but this is something you need to actively think about. And now if you look at it, you see that most of the content is actually labeled as free access but rights reserved, which means basically you're free to look at it, but it's under copyright. We have some content which is under restricted access, surprisingly little content which is labeled as being in the public domain. Then we have a bit of content which apparently you have to pay for to get access to. And then we have relatively few content which is under open content licenses. And stuff which is unknown. This unknown field is really included for situations where you can't identify what right applies to the content that's made available through Europeana. And I just want to look at a couple of examples here. So the first hit, which is I'm actually not quite sure what that does in Europeana, if that's really part of our cultural heritage. It's like a floor plan of the meeting rooms of the University Library of Vienna, for those of you who don't speak German. And this is actually a good example because it's mislabeled. It says, oops, go back, it says there's restricted access to that, so there should be some kind of restriction on the access. When we go further, click to view the object in its original content, we actually see that it's Creative Commons license. So it's not restrictive access. It should be labeled in Europeana with the Creative Commons license. By the way, I find this very strange. There's more social media buttons, licensing symbols on this thing than the actual object in pixels. A bit strange example. Anyway, next example, something provided by the organization which is hosting this conference, the Austrian National Library, and there seems to be some mismatching going on between the rights information which has been applied and the actual rights status of that work. As you can see here, it says it's copyrighted, but there is free access. If you look here, you see it's from 1785, which pretty clearly indicates that the thing can't be copyrighted anymore. In this case, if you go further on the website of the Austrian National Library, you actually see that they never make a copyright claim about this work on their own website. So it's probably something where the aligning of rights information and the actual rights information is going wrong somewhere in the ingestion process. Obviously, this would also need to be fixed in the future. And then another example, the third example, this is something provided by the, I think it's the Municipal Archive of Leipzig, a postcard about a workers' Olympic Games in Vienna in 1931, which simply doesn't contain rights information, which is a pity, because this one is actually available in quite high resolution on the thing, so you could potentially do something with it if you knew if you are allowed to do something or not. This should carry a rights statement. This should either say this is all rights reserved, please don't do anything with it, because the copyright of the original author still applies, or it could be if the copyright is with the library in Leipzig, then they could decide to put a Creative Commons license on it to signal that certain uses of this postcard are allowed, and if it's in the public domain, which being from 1931 could potentially be the case, then it should be labeled as such. So in short, we need, in the coming years, I think we need to work hard that we get more of this content which is Creative Commons license. There's like, well, it's under 0.5% of the content about Vienna in Europeana is Creative Commons licensed at the moment. And we need much more of this public domain content, which is actually labeled as public domain content, clearly identifying that you can actually work with this stuff. And in order to achieve that, we are currently working or making a work plan, or actually we're in negotiations with the European Commission on a follow-up project, or where we follow up the work that we've done in Europeana Connect. The project is called Europeana Awareness. And there's basically three things that we're going to do, that we're going to work on. One is to work on mechanisms for rights clearance, and especially extended collective licensing mechanisms, in order to make it possible for Europe's cultural heritage organizations to digitize more content and make it available online in the first place. This generally will apply to copyrighted content, so probably there is no reuse rights attached to this stuff, but making content available which is available in analog form in the libraries, in digital form, is one of the big challenges. The second aspect that we're going to do, and that probably includes a lot of workshopping and preaching and explaining again, is to improve compliance with the Europeana data model, specifically filling in the Europeana rights field with correct values, and the Europeana Public Domain Charter, which clearly states that something which is in the public domain in analog form must be made available under a public domain status in Europeana if it's submitted. And finally, we will promote the use of Creative Commons licenses for digital objects in Europeana. This is something that can be tricky as long as a library or a museum or an archive doesn't own the copyright in the objects they are making available. This cannot be done, but there is probably large groups of content where the rights have actually been transferred to the organizations hosting this, and in these cases, the Creative Commons licenses can and should be used in order to make the content more usable and to integrate the actual digital objects in the open data ecosystem that Europeana is developing, as we heard over the last 2 days. Well, that's my thoughts on open data or open content and the Europeana licensing framework, and thanks.